Oh hey, welcome back. We've all heard that offset guitars are super bright and trebly, right? And that people who are picking up a Jazzmaster who are used to Telecasters or Stratocasters or any kind of Gibson guitar often find them unthinkably trebly and really struggle to adjust to using an offset guitar.
So it's louder.
Right.
And it's way treblier.
Way treblier. This top end of this is ripping my head off.
It's aggressive, isn't it?
Well, how can you even go about using such a guitar in a band context or in a live situation without making people's ears bleed? And can you even make such a bright guitar sit nicely in a band mix? Well, while there are some offset players who like to swap out their tone and volume controls for lower value pots or to swap out their pickups for darker, more mid-range heavy pickups, I personally want my offset guitars to sound like offset guitars. So how can someone like me take one of these instruments and use it effectively in a band context? While using the tone control could help in this situation, I personally just want to set my guitar's controls and forget about them and focus on actually playing. So here's my top 6 tips on how to tune in your live rig to get killer offset tone. I'm currently playing in a post-punk noise rock band, which is a 3-piece that has a really loud fuzzy bass player, a chaotic drummer, and then me on guitar, often doing more intricate, sparkly guitar work. I find that using all 6 of these tips together gives me a really usable, really nice offset guitar tone that really sits well in a band mix. However, any one of these 6 tips should help improve your live guitar sound if you're struggling using an offset guitar live. Okay, so the first thing that is really important to dial in on an offset guitar, and this is pretty elementary, is the pickup height. And actually on an offset guitar, this is perhaps more important than on any other kind of guitar. As a general rule, the closer your pickups are to the underside of the strings, the more bass and the more treble you're going to get in your guitar's sound, and it's going to introduce more of a harsh or brash quality to the sound. So, therefore, if you're finding your guitar's tone a bit brash or a bit harsh when you're using your amp and you're playing at a loud volume, the first thing I would consider doing would be to really spend some time tuning in your guitar's pickup heights. The really cool thing about Jazzmaster pickups in particular is not only can you adjust the angle of the pickups side to side in this direction, but because you have 4 adjustment screws, you can also angle the pickup up and down in this direction. If you adjust your pickups at an angle like this, so it's slightly closer on the neck side than it is on the bridge side of each pickup, this is going to subtly reduce the high-end content that you're going to be amplifying through your guitar's electronics, and it's going to give you a slightly fuller sound as well. This added versatility and added adjustability of a Jazzmaster pickup compared with really any other kind of guitar pickup really lets you fine-tune the balance in a subtle way of treble to bass that your pickups are going to be sending through to your amp. My second secret tip for getting killer offset guitar tone in your live rig is that, believe it or not, you can actually use the rhythm circuit on your offset guitar. I personally like to use this in a couple of different ways. Firstly, if I want to play a really moody part that I want to sit a little bit further back in the mix, I'll engage the rhythm circuit and play it with the rhythm circuit controls engaged. Then when you come to the really high energy part of your song, you can flick back to the lead circuit and use the really biting and bright sound of your offset guitar to paint a really high contrast sonic landscape with your instrument. second way you can use your rhythm circuit to get really sick live offset guitar tones is to use it with a wall full of fuzz. Again, using a really fat fuzzed out tone with the rhythm circuit during a verse section, and then contrasting that with the biting, cutting, clarity and definition of the bridge pickup for a chorus section is something that I really like to do. The next tool that I've found to be really useful when using offset guitars is to find an amp that has a global high cut control. In other words, don't be afraid to turn the treble down. Now, I've found the Victory Copper to be a really nice match for my offset guitars, and that's because it has a really fat and full voice, but it's also very clean, very chimey and very jangly as well. It also has a full tone stack of treble, middle and bass, which comes after the gain stage, and then it has a global high cut control which comes before the gain stage. This is really useful as an offset guitar player because I can use the global high cut or the tone control to dial in exactly how much of the super bright treble from my offset guitar makes it into the Victory's preamp circuit, and this allows me to shape the gain structure of the amp and to determine how much of this guitar's treble content is fed into that. However, if you don't have this feature, like I said, a presence control does a very similar job on certain amps, but also just don't be afraid to turn the treble control down on your amp. I think as guitar players we're kind of hardwired to want all of our controls on 10 if not 11, or at least for our knobs to be at 12 o'clock or at 2 o'clock. However, it's really important, particularly as an offset guitar player using such a bright guitar, to dial in your settings using your ears and not your eyes. I know it can look really odd and weird if our tone control or our treble control is turned all the way down to 0, and it feels inherently wrong and uncomfortable. However, if your amp or pedal sounds best with the tone all the way off, then turn the tone all the way off. Remember, if it sounds good, it is good. After all, our old pal Mike has his tone controls at 0 or turned down really low, and he has sick offset guitar tone. Okay, so secret number 4 is to use a fat, dark amp with a tone shaping underdrive. This is one that I've actually only just started using recently myself, but it's one that I'm really enjoying. The first step here is to get your biggest, loudest, gainiest sound dialed in first. I find this works particularly well with a fatter or fuzzier sound, but this can apply or can work just with the preamp gain of your amplifier as well. For this job, I am using this Color Sound Power Boost by KO Amps running into this orange OR120 FET preamp pedal, and that is then going into the front end of my Victory V4 Copper. And this turns my clean, chimey, bell-like amp into something that gives us a really fun, really fat overdrive sound for a Jazzmaster that takes away any hint of harshness or spikiness or any ear-piercing qualities. However, this is too gainy and too loud and too chaotic for the rhythm parts I play in this band, which involve a lot of weird, intricate, higher note playing and riffs, inspired by Johnny Marr. So then, I'm using this clone from Boot Instruments as an underdrive. I have the volume set below unity, I have just a touch of gain added, and the tone is adjusted to taste. This gives me a lower gain sound for rhythm playing and for those intricate wiggly things that I do a lot in my band songs. It still gives a tone that's really nice and punchy, and I can dial in exactly how much brightness I want to hit the OR120 preamp stage. And I find this works really well. The Klon does a really good job of this, but I also actually have a second tone shaping underdrive on my board as well. And that is this orange 2-stroke Parametric EQ boost. And with this underdrive, although this pedal doesn't go below unity gain in terms of its output level, I've scooped so much of the lower mids out of this sound, and I've also toned down the upper mids as well in the high end, that it has the effect of lowering the overall gain going into the pedal, and this just gives me a different flavour. Here I have more low end intact, but I scoop out a lot of that orange low mid character. If you don't have an overdrive pedal that goes below unity gain in terms of its output level, or a boost pedal that goes below unity, you can do a similar trick with a compressor pedal. Ideally, you're going to want one that tightens up the low end maybe, maybe rounds off the highs, and I find this 1176 style compressor from Joyo to do an excellent job of that. The thing that's really cool about this method is that you can still stack overdrives before you're tone shaping underdrive. It still sounds really good, it still feels really good, and then when you're ready to let all hell break loose at the climax of your song, you can turn off the underdrive to get that huge, mega, massive sound. I find using this method allows me to tailor the sound of my gain stages much better, and by using the trick of having the heavier, fatter, louder amp sound set up in the OR100, that means that everything that comes before that is going to be shaped through that fatter, louder, gainier gain stage, which means that all of that unnecessary or unpleasant high end is getting cut off in that pedal, and then we can set everything around that pedal by tailoring what goes into it. And I think that works really, really well. And on an offset guitar with 1 meg pots, this works much better than rolling the volume down. My next tip comes off the back of what we've just been discussing with my orange OR120 preamp pedal, and that is to play loud. And the reason for this is that if you're using a traditional vintage style amp, the more you turn up the gain on your power amp section or even your preamp section, the fuller and warmer your sound will become, and the more the high end will be attenuated. If you've seen Dan and Mick complaining about the bright cap in their Marshall Plexi amp, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So if you have a vintage style Marshall or orange amp, definitely make sure to turn up the gain, either the preamp or the power amp gain, to get a much more saturated and full sound that eliminates those harsh treble frequencies that you get with the amps turned down low. This is definitely the case with the orange OR120 preamp, and it's why an underdrive works so particularly well with that circuit. I've really struggled with this, particularly with my BluGuitar Amp 1 Mercury edition, and that's because that amp uses a bright cap because it's based on vintage style amps, and I like the gain control down really low on the Plexi channel of the Blug amp. However, it just makes the sound so bright that I need the treble turned down to 0 on that amp if I'm using it at gig volume. Whereas as soon as you start turning the preamp gain up to 5, 6, 7, 8, you can then increase the treble control to about 5 and get the same amount of treble in your signal as with the treble control on 0 and the gain on 3 or 4. So turning up the master to get the power amp section really cooking, or just increasing the preamp gain could help you out a lot if you're struggling with a really bright guitar sound in your live rig that you just can't dial that harsh treble out of. And my final tip, and maybe my favorite one out of the lot, is that if you're using a cab with 2 speakers in it, try wiring them in parallel rather than in series. Most modern amps with 2 speakers will come stock with the speakers wired in series. And this means that the signal will flow from your amp into one speaker and then from that speaker into the second speaker. And this results in a tighter, punchier low end character, but it can also introduce a harsh quality to the high end of your guitar's amplified sound. However, if you wire your speakers in parallel, as was common with vintage amps, this means that the signal from your amplifier is hitting both speakers at the same time. The result of this is that you get more low end, and that extra low end has a looser character to it, but you also get a rounder, sweeter high end. If you're playing a Gibson Les Paul or an SG with P90s, this difference isn't going to be that obvious to you in terms of the change in the high end. However, if you're using a really bright trebly offset guitar, wiring your speakers in parallel can really help with taking the edge off the treble frequencies of your guitar and make it just sound much more pleasant and much more musical. The only thing to remember is that changing your speakers from being wired together in series to being wired together in parallel will change their total impedance. If you have 2 8-ohm speakers wired in series, the signal flows into one speaker and then is sent across into the other speaker. And so you get the total ohmage of those 2 speakers added together, which would be 16 ohms. Whereas if you have the same 2 speakers wired in parallel, the signal is being divided between those 2 speakers. And so 8 ohms divided by 2 equals a total of 4 ohms. So before you try this, it's really important that you calculate what the ohmage of the speakers is going to be wired in parallel, and that you make sure that your amp supports that level of ohmage or that ohmage rating. However, if you're able to do it, I highly recommend it. It's been a total game changer for me and using offset guitars live. Cool, so I hope you've enjoyed those 6 secrets or those 6 tips for getting killer offset guitar tone with your live rig. I'd be really interested to hear how many of these you guys are already using and which of these you guys are going to go off and try now. And please, if you do try them, let me know how you find them in the comment section below. I'll be really interested to find out how these translate to your rig as well. Cool, well that's everything for today's video. I hope you've really enjoyed that and that you found it fun and helpful and useful. I'm sure there's going to be more videos on offset guitar tips in the future in terms of tone, setup, all sorts of different things. So please do stick around and subscribe if you're interested in that kind of thing. Alright then, well until next time, take it easy, look after yourselves, and we'll see each other again soon.